Welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. I'm Kristen Balasia, Vice President of Consulting Services at S&P Global Mobility. I'm happy to be joined today by Tom DeVleesschauwer, Global Director of Mobility, and Mark Boyadjis, Global Technology Lead Consulting Services. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Morning.
A few weeks ago, we hosted our 40th, believe it or not, CERAWeek, which is widely considered to be the most prestigious gathering of CEOs, ministers, policymakers from global energy and utilities, certainly, but also from automotive, technology, manufacturing, and the financial community. And both Tom and Mark had the opportunity to be there. The theme of this year's conference was Pace of Change, Energy, Climate, and Innovation. And from what we've seen and heard, it did not disappoint. We had speakers like Jennifer Granholm, John Kerry, Jim Farley, RJ Scaringe, to name just a few. There was a lot of discussion around the increasing pace of change and what will be required throughout the journey of energy transition, and specifically in the mobility sector, which we're going to spend the next several minutes talking about. So, Tom, we'll start with you. And, quite obviously these days, the link between energy and mobility has never been closer. What did we see and hear with this interaction between the energy companies, the mobility space, or OEMs specifically at CERAWeek?
Well, great question there, Kristen. Well, I think, the answer, trying to keep it short, is that even though most of the automotive participants so far don't all realize it yet, but there is a very much an intrinsic linkage between the energy and the mobility sectors. And currently, I think it only really becomes more obvious when you view it from a perspective of an energy company or an oil company, as they used to be called. Now, clearly, we need a fuel source for our mobility, but it goes beyond that. Leading energy companies already have a history of working very closely with leading vehicle manufacturers. I mean, just thinking about lubrications, oils that we use within our traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. But also, the transition to its electrification is not really that different. It's just that now we might also need to talk to a new set of participants. And with that, I really mean particularly the vehicle manufacturers. We need to start considering to talk to and involve utilities in that. Also, power grid operators. Power grid is, depending where you are, in which nation around the world, could cause some problems. And of course, the wider technology companies who will help, with providing other services, other opportunities. And currently, we see huge investments from all the major energy companies, and particularly in the area of fueling electric vehicles. And I kind of particularly say it as fueling electric vehicles. I mean, we really would say, I guess, charging those. But that's kind of the next opportunity there for many of these energy companies. And, we heard from BP, one of the big oil majors, that they are going to earmark about half of all of its investments by 2025 into vehicle charging solutions. So it's really kind of, highlighting how important this really is. And it really makes sense because they already have real estate. I mean, they're gas stations as we know them today. And now these are rapidly becoming energy stations. And we shouldn't, of course, also not forget that it's not just about electricity and charging. Energy companies will continue to be at the forefront, say, for alternative solutions required in some markets, biofuels, e-fuels, or hydrogen solutions. But it really is, I guess, a reminder that in some emerging markets, there will still be a chance to, sell and retail natural gas for mobility purposes as well. So it really is a connection that was there before, which is now growing even much stronger.
And that's a great segue. The other key area of this transition is that fueling or charging. And Mark, when you think about the charging infrastructure and the interplay or cooperation between parties, from tech to the EVSEs to the energy companies to the consumers, energy as a service was being discussed as well. Can you talk a little bit about this, Mark?
Sure. Everyone's seen a lot of the highlights from various government incentives and announcements that come out on energy infrastructure to supply the fueling needed for the electric vehicles for both consumer and commercial adoption. But the reality is there's a transition that the consumer needs to take into this realm, and the idea of moving into a different payment method, a different fueling method, a different solution for for managing, you know, the powering of our mobility fleet is what the energy industry has in play today, and that's what they're looking to solve, because it's a different model. We're not talking about refining liquid fuels into the future, at least. We're not talking about refining liquid fuels, distributing them, you know, globally and nationally and regionally and on a city by city basis. But we're talking about how the grid is going to provide, you know, solutions, and what novel technologies and novel solutions can come into play to optimize that. Today's draw on the grid is X, but tomorrow's draw on the grid with the, you know, evolution of both consumer and commercial electrification will be greater and greater. And so what we need to do as an industry, as industries between energy and mobility, is think about, you know, smart ways to evolve this fueling, you know, I wouldn't say quagmire, but this fueling problem, right? How we get all the electric vehicles charged, to make sure that it doesn't, you know, injure or cripple the grid in the process. And so there's lots of different interesting and novel ways that that technology is being deployed to enable that, from vehicle to grid charging to time of use and demand charges, to incenting user participation in real time, you know, status monitoring of charging stations, all sorts of different things. So, you know, the energy industry is seeing that transition from how they generate, right, this clean energy transition. But as we look to fuel the mobility fleet of the future, we also have to think about novel ways to provide services to both fleet and end users, so that they can take use of it, make use of the new infrastructure.
And this is not a one speed or one answer story here. Tom, you hinted at this. How do you see the energy mobility transition rolling out geographically?
Well, it's a big world out there, and clearly, you know, it's not going to move in the same speed in all the different nations. So it really is truly a multi-speed rollout, and I think the lead markets are pretty much clear today. I mean, obviously, you know, we're looking at China, mainland China, you know, already, you know, the biggest EV market today. But you know, Europe and the United States of America are really, you know, following very close onto this. And you know, just behind that, we're sort of looking at the you know, other leading OECD nations. I mean, thinking like, you know, places like, you know, South Korea, you know, and others. So I think that's pretty clear. Of course, right today, you know, we are aware that, you know, the supply chain globally is a bit out of sync. There's also some issues with you know, price inflations in commodities or other parts, but we'll get to that later. But so those things could also slightly potentially affect or change that role of the speed of that rollout. But I would argue that there's a role again for the politicians here, that they also need to recognize that this geographic impact due to climate change is different around the world. And that might suggest that actually the proposed solutions, you know, if we're looking at it, you know, from our mobility transition perspective or others, that we might need different solutions around the world that suit those local needs. And you know, this is not something that you know, might happen everywhere, but I think it might imply that, you know, in some of those emerging markets that we see today, that maybe there might still be a need for quite some, you know, degree of time into the future, that we still have some fossil fuel dependency. You know, I mean, that could be, you know, forms of biofuels or e-fuels, but at the end of the day, there is a high likelihood that we still have for a longer period of time some internal combustion engine usage and production for that required. Now that raises some questions, of course, you know, for the vehicle manufacturers. You know, where do you want to produce those? You know, if global demand for internal combustion engine mobility is going down, well, you know, what kind of volumes? What is that going to do to the pricing? So there's quite a lot of sort of issues still that haven't really been resolved yet, which is something that the industry has been very sort of coy about right now to try to discuss that. But I think one good indicator, sort of like of this mobility transition, with the energy part related to it, i.e., electrification, is if we would look at the electric bus market, around the world today. I mean, China is like the number one EV market, or NEV market, as they call it there. And they have something like roughly, I off the top of my head, I think about 800,000, electric buses. But the US, I mean, it's a very big market for school buses, the biggest in the world. And the day will come when all US school buses, I guess, will go electric, and then we're looking at something like 500,000 of those. So that could really provide that sort of impetus to the whole industry sector and to the different stakeholders that, wow, it's getting serious now. We all need to get on board with us. And just to think of those like, emerging markets, a market like India, where electrification, up until very recently has sort of been struggling really, and now the government is throwing quite a bit of support to it. There's a lot of buses in India, and they could again provide that sort of, that starting shot really to get that going. But I think no one said the transition was going to be easy. But I think, we're heading in the right direction from everything that we've heard at CERAWeek. And I'm sure that Mark will probably talk much more about that to us.
Well, a couple of things there, Tom. First of all, when you describe that global transition and you talk about not just how people are going to have to charge, but what people are going to have to, or organizations are going to have to build based on what people are going to buy and based on so many variables in their specific markets, it conjures up the picture to me of somebody stepping off one subway train heading one direction, stepping onto another heading in the other, and by the way, they're both moving. So there are a lot of considerations and things at play. And so Mark, if we look at going from that global perspective to lower levels of geography, what impacts do cities have on the build out of electrification?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most fascinating panels I watched at CERAWeek was the one where we had the mayor of Houston, the mayor of Aberdeen, and the mayor of Halifax talking about energy cities. And it was Mike Savage, he's the mayor of Halifax in Canada, said cities are where emissions happen. They're ever more important in the fight against climate change and the energy transition globally. And I think that's really an astute point, right? Because we can talk about global or national emission structure, but to Tom's point that he was talking about, this is very much perceived and very much realized on a regional basis, on a municipal basis. And that's why we see different, in countries all over the world, you see different emissions policies and different things in different major cities because that's where the emissions happen. And it really hits at the cities and their role in permitting and incentivizing and organizing to enable the distribution of these infrastructure development initiatives, because they're the ones literally where it's being put in the ground, right? So this is something that they need to measure the impact that their city has on the evolution of this clean energy transition, and how they can drive that, how they can be a supporter in that, an active supporter. You can also look at how they impact the fleet side, right? These cities have a large fleet of different municipal vehicles, from small scale trucks and cars to buses and that sort of thing. Tom was mentioning the transit authorities or transit buses. What's really interesting is different transit authorities will scope out the types of buses that they want in the future, and there's no like one size fits all. It's all custom engagement, right? Yet they're all looking for electrification. The important thing is, though, as the city sees this transition towards an electric bus, they need to also consider not just the cost of building, or not just the cost of acquiring these electric buses, but also the cost of building the infrastructure to support it. That's maybe a lesser known consideration, but in most cases, the city is going to have to build, either a partnership with an existing footprint infrastructure or their own new depots. In many cases, it's going to be the latter. And Emmanuel Toussaint was with Novabus, was mentioning that in reality, the electric buses need to come last for a city to really be able to utilize them. She said prior to some 2 to 3 years of upgrades or new depot buildings must occur to factor in that infrastructure for any EV buses to operate, because you can't just buy this bus and then start charging it down the street in someone's garage. So, you know, it's a consideration, and it's something that the cities need to be aware of, both as they build out their strategies, but also as they try and fund these different things.
So your garage isn't big enough to charge a bus. Okay. Yeah, no, a lot.
Nor is my bill going to support that.
Right, true. So I want to jump back, Mark. I have another question for you, but jump back to something that Tom said that made me kind of laugh. Tom, you described the current situation with the supply chain as a bit out of sync, which I like that. I think there's a lot of people that might state it a little bit more strongly. And when you look at EVs, Mark, I mean, another really critical area of consideration is the battery supply chain. You know, what is the industry thinking about with battery supply chain, and what was discussed at CERAWeek? Maybe you can share a little bit of that specific insights from CERAWeek and other conversations that you've had and research we've done.
Sure. The battery supply chain piece is top of mind for anyone involved in the industry trying to build EVs. You can't mine it fast enough, and you can't. You know, all of these OEMs are coming on board in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years with full electrification, and all of a sudden the battery supply chain is, wait, what? How is this going to work? You know, I landed in Houston at CERAWeek and rushed down to the hotel because I wanted to see RJ Scringe with Rivian speak, and one of his comments was so stark. You know, it bears repeating. He said 90 to 95% of the battery capacity supply chain in the industry will need to be built in the next 10 years, right? And it hasn't been built yet. So, like, if you factor in that sheer scale of underdeveloped capacity, you know, he likened it to the semiconductor supply chain crisis. He's like, that will make semiconductors seem like a blip on the radar. So I don't know whether or not, you know, his assumptions are correct on just what percentage is needed, but we do know there's a massive gap there. Our own research says that you know, we'll see a lot more in the form of recycling come on board, and I think that that's a great initiative, right? Because, you know, we don't want to continue to just dig into the ground and then, you know, trash these batteries and create more toxic waste in landfills. And so there's just as much interest in mining virgin mined materials as there is in battery recycling, because over the next 10 years, we estimate that there'll be a cumulative 17.7 million metric tons of batteries reaching their end of life. And it equates to roughly 1.8 terawatt hours of battery capacity. And more than 80% of those will come from cars, electric vehicles. So when you've got, you know, literally tons of lithium batteries that are end of life, and billions of dollars of potentially new raw materials to recycle and then enhance for new vehicle generation. I think there's a huge amount of interest in that battery recycling piece, and it's something we're looking into quite closely right now. Our customers are asking for more detail on that. So we estimate that the global industry will have to see 100% increase over the next 5 years in battery recycling capacity to help feed this need, because there's not going to be enough materials to really supply the electrification trend. And then lastly, this is not just an industry problem. You have the Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, talking about how it's a matter of national security, right? National and economic security to have a full battery supply chain in the U.S. And every other country is thinking about it that same way. We also had the acting deputy secretary of the Department of State talking about how important it is to supply these critical materials. Kimberly Harrington said a typical EV requires 6 times more critical minerals than a conventional gas vehicle. And she said that's what's driving much of the State Department's investment right now in this area. So it's you know, both political, it's business, and it's technology innovation that, you know, this critical supply chain crunch that we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years is going to really materialize itself.
So we've touched on a lot of the variables, and not even all of the variables that, excuse me, are going to come into play throughout this, you know, energy mobility transition. So I'm going to ask a final question. I'm going to make it a tough question in that I'm going to ask that you guys try and answer in a couple of sentences. Tom and Mark, what do you think is really going to be required to move our industry closer to a sustainable future? In a couple sentences. Tom, why don't you go first?
That's such an easy question there. Yeah, right. Okay. I'll try to be very short and precise about it. Okay. I would say it's cooperation is absolutely going to be key within this. And I don't just mean cooperation like, you know, within the automotive industry, across industry sectors. And unfortunately, I think, you know, the automotive industry doesn't have a very good track record on that. But, you know, there is some light on the horizon. You know, VW and Ford jointly will be producing EVs, and GM and Honda as well. So there is hope. But the other important part, I think, that we shouldn't underestimate is that the skill sets that you know, the industry requires, you know, moving forward, looking at the technology required, is something that's probably again restricted in supply. So we do need to make sure that we don't ignore that. And I think, you know, that's the 2 points that I would really look at.
Great, thank you. Mark, without saying what he said, what's your perspective?
You know, I need to help like deliver this one. It's cooperation, Kristen. It seriously is. He stole the words right out of my mouth, but I'm going to emphasize it because you know, when you're making this transition of this scale, you cannot expect one industry to handle it. You cannot expect government to play catch up, right? There needs to be industry cooperation throughout the whole process so we don't double our efforts, right? The last thing we want to have happen is that infrastructure is built out in an inefficient manner, and then we've wasted potentially billions of dollars doing it the wrong way. There's one last piece. Aside from cooperation, it's really imperative that we educate end customers. There's still a massive amount of anxiety and unawareness of what's available in the marketplace and how you change the way you use mobility when it's electrified. Education is paramount, and I think that those two can come. Cooperation and education can come in lockstep, but the industry needs to help. You know, anything from helping the customers understand where and how to charge and to understand what kilowatt hours are versus miles per gallon. So education and cooperation are my two pieces.
Thank you for joining us today, and we'll be back with more Fuel for Thought next month. To opt into our newsletter that provides more information on this topic and others, please visit ihsmarket.com/auto newsletter.